live and start recording. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Davide. As a very brief introduction, Davide has just finished his PhD at UC San Diego. He's just moved to Palo Alto, and where he's going to be working with Guido Imbens. So this is not his job market paper, because he's presented his job market paper, I would guess, at least a dozen times by now, first on the job market, and then second on the Restud tour, which he's just returned from in Italy. So it's a pleasure to have you here and presenting a paper with Kaspar Wuthrich.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. All right, and please feel free to interrupt at any time if you have question or anything is not clear or for anything. So this is a joint project with Kaspar Wuthrich and Paul Niehaus. Both are professor at UCSD. I just graduated from UCSD. So when we think about multiple hypothesis testing, we need to disentangle different reasons of why people conduct multiple hypothesis testing. Now, in applied paper, we may have multiple treatments, and so we would like to adjust for testing the effect of different treatments. We may want to test the effect of a single treatment on multiple subgroups, say people of different age or education. Or also, we may want to test the effect of a given treatment on multiple outcomes. Now, there is some very intuitive explanation of why we want to adjust inference for multiple hypothesis testing. So let's just consider a simple setting where we have 100 true null hypotheses, and we're going to test each of these with mutually independent tests. And each test is going to have some size of 5%. Now, if this is the type of test that we want to conduct, the probability of rejecting at least one true null hypothesis will be approximately 1. That is, we're not going to be able to control notions of compound error across all possible tests at the target level 5%. And so there is some intuition that if we want to control some notion of compound error, we need to do something to adjust for multiplicity. Now, when I talk about compound error, we may have different notions in mind. And in fact, people use very different types of compound error in practice. So one example is, for instance, controlling for the family-wise error rate, which is the probability of rejecting at least one true null hypothesis, which is what I just explained in the previous example. Now, a second notion is the false discovery rate, which is the expected proportion of incorrectly rejecting null hypotheses. Now, if we do have multiple outcomes, what people do in practice is actually to first aggregate outcomes into a single index, and then circumvent the problem of multiple hypothesis testing by conducting tests on that particular index. And so these are control such a notion. And again, the simplest example is to use a Bonferroni correction, for instance, if we want to control the family-wise error rate. Or you can also use other types of correction, which may be less conservative. Now, to motivate a little bit what I just explained, let me show you two graphs. In the first graph, what we do is that we're going to count across the top 5 econ journals the percentage of papers which adjust inference for multiple hypothesis testing across the paper published across the experimental papers. So what we do observe is that multiple hypothesis testing is a raising concern in economics. And the percentage of paper which adjust inference for multiple hypothesis testing raises from 0% up to approximately 40% in 2020. Now, the big issue here is that different papers do very different things. So if we look across the papers which do adjust inference for multiple hypothesis testing, we do observe that some papers adjust by controlling for the family-wise error rates, others do some indexing, others do false discovery rate, some of these papers do multiple of these things, and so on. So there is substantial variation in whether and how inference should be adjusted for multiple hypothesis testing in applied research. So we start from this point, and we try to propose a framework to tell to practitioners whether and how we should adjust inference for multiple hypothesis testing as a function of the economic environment. That is, we want to provide a formal justification of why and when you want to control particular notion of compound errors. Now, when I refer to the economic environment, I'm thinking about different aspects that may play a role in your research process. So for instance, you can have different types, different nature of multiplicity. That is, you may want to test for multiple treatments or multiple outcomes or multiple subgroups and so on. You may also take into account research cost of testing more and more hypotheses. And finally, you may also want to take into account the welfare or the policy implication that your recommendation, that is your hypothesis test, will induce. Now, to achieve this goal, what we do is that we propose a model of the publication process that explicitly takes into account the incentives of the researcher, but also the constraints which arise through the costs that the researcher face. Now, to be a little bit more concrete, let me tell you that there are three core ideas of this model. The first idea is that research is a public good, and policy decisions are influenced by hypothesis tests. So what this means is that a researcher will conduct some experiments, are gonna put online the working papers, or they're gonna share the working paper with policymaker, and their recommendation in their working paper is gonna affect policymaking. That is, it's gonna have an effect on decisions. Now, while research is a public good, on the other hand, research costs are borne privately, which means that each researcher can decide whether to run an experiment and write a paper in the first place based on their own incentives. And their own incentive depends on the publication prospect with respect to that paper. Now, there exists a regulator. We can think about the editor or editorial standards, which can enforce ex ante, that is, before the paper is submitted and the experiment is run, certain hypothesis testing protocol, such as adjusting inference in a certain way. Now, given this framework, our goal is to characterize the testing protocol that maximize the worst case welfare. Now, worst case with respect to the possible effects that your recommendation, that is your test, is going to induce from a policymaking perspective, but at the same time needs to trade off two different objectives. One is avoiding bad policy advice, but the second one is also to motivate research. And so still induce researchers to conduct research when research can have some positive effects. Now, the assumption of the model can just, please, yes.
Can I ask, so does the researcher have to, or does the editor or the researcher have to know what the possible policy consequences are at the time of the publication decision?
Right. So the idea is that I'm going to be explicit in a few slides, but the idea here is that you're going to run a test. And if you reject the null hypothesis that a given treatment, for instance, has a negative effect, then there exists a policymaker which will say, well, we know that this effect is going to be positive, and so I'm going to implement it on the population. And so this will affect policymaking decision. And the idea of this process is that in general, researchers may either work closely with, say, NGOs, which happens in practice in development studies, or for instance, researcher may just read the paper, policymaker may just read the paper and then use the paper as a motivation to motivate some particular policy decisions.
Sure. I guess I'm trying to understand, though, to what extent the quantum of policy, I mean, the worst case welfare over policy effects already requires an understanding of the distribution of policy outcomes arising from the paper. Right.
So the policy outcomes are not known to the editor. That is, the treatment effects are unknown.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Yes. This is why worst case, because the editor doesn't know the treatment effects. And the model's assumption can justify single hypothesis testing. So in general, justification of single hypothesis testing itself is a hard task. And so you need a model which justifies why you want to conduct hypothesis testing in the first place, as opposed, for instance, of being a Bayesian decision maker and so on, which we don't do in this framework. Now, as I was mentioning before, a key feature of our model is that each hypothesis test corresponds to a given decision. So if you as a researcher recommend a given policy, then there exists a policymaker which will implement such a policy. Now, if we look about different nature of multiplicity, this a connection between hypothesis test and policy making can be different. So if we think in terms of multiple treatments, there is a natural one-to-one mapping between tests and decisions. That is, each recommendation for each given treatment has a natural mapping to a given implementation on a new population. Now, if we think in terms of multiple outcomes, this becomes a little bit more difficult because we can think about different tests as having or not having effects on policymaking. So if we have a single policymaker, that is, if we only have to make a single decision, but we test such a decision on multiple outcomes, then it might be that there is no connection between all possible tests and all possible decisions. And so what we need to do is that we need to look at the model from two different angles. The first angle is where we only have one single policymaker, and so one single decision, but you still have multiple tests. And the second angle is when instead each outcome corresponds to a different policymaker, and what you're trying to convey is basically what we're trying to do is to communicate to an heterogeneous audience. And I'm going to be explicit about this in the second part of the talk. So to give you an outline of the talk goes as follows. I'm first going to discuss the case of multiple treatments, where there is a natural one-to-one connection with hypothesis testing and policymaking. I then going to discuss the problem with multiple outcomes, where we have a single treatment, and then I'm going to conclude. Now, to visualize a little bit more the problem, we can say that hypothesis tests branch out into two separate problems. The first is multiple treatments. And what we're going to show is that in the context of multiple treatment, what really matters for conducting or not conducting multiple hypothesis testing adjustment are the research costs that the researcher borne privately. So whenever the research costs exhibit some return to scale with respect to the number of hypotheses that they test, multiple hypothesis testing will arise naturally. When instead research costs grow linearly with the number of tests, then we're going to have different conclusions. Now, in the context of multiple outcomes, we're going to first analyze the context where we have an homogeneous audience, that is a single policymaker. But however, we want to communicate the effect on many possible outcomes, on many possible noisy observations. And then the second context is when instead we have an heterogeneous audience. So let me touch on the literature very briefly. So this paper connects to the literature on economic analysis of optimal statistical approaches. But none of this paper I mentioned here focus on the problem of multiple hypothesis testing. Now, there is also some literature about models of scientific communication. And here we relate in the sense of, especially our analysis of multiple outcomes and heterogeneous audience relate to the problem of scientific communication. But again, none of these papers study the problem for hypothesis testing, multiple hypothesis testing. We then more closely relate to the literature on statistical methods for multiple hypothesis testing correction. But the difference here is that we don't develop a particular method to control a given notion of compound error, but instead we provide guidance for choosing appropriate methods based on the economic environment. That is, we don't take the notion of compound error as axiomatic. Finally, we connect to the literature on decision theory in hypothesis testing. And the key idea in our framework is that we're going to use an economic model which motivates how, but also when we need to adjust for multiple hypothesis testing. And again, none of these papers study the problem from the economic model perspective where you have incentives between different agents. All right, any questions so far?
The decision theoretic literature. There was an approach. I was told of a book by Ferguson in '67 that took a decision theoretic approach to statistics. That's in the tradition of Wald and Robbins, or is that a different approach?
That's correct. That's
okay.
In the tradition of Wald and Robbins.
Thank you.
And so the difference here is that we don't look at a single decision maker problem, but instead we look at a problem where you have a decision maker with opposite incentives. That is, we look at the problem as a game between different decision makers, and we characterize hypothesis testing as a result of the game. As opposed, in general, the whole perspective is more like you have a single decision maker, and then you're going to characterize the optimal decision in that context. Yeah. All right. let me discuss the problem with multiple treatments. So the players that we have are the following. First, we have a representative researcher, and the researcher decides whether to pursue an experiment based on its publication prospects. So the only decision that the researcher has is whether to run the experiment in the first place or not. There exists then a social planner, which chooses a testing procedure to maximize the worst-case welfare. Again, worst case with respect to the policy effects. That is, the social planner doesn't know what's going to be the policy effect of a given recommendation, and so it's going to be conservative with respect to that. Now, when we think about
the researcher's payoff is binary, 1 if published, 0 if not, or?
No, so the publication prospect is basically characterized by the probability of publishing.
Okay, but all the researcher cares about is the probability of publishing.
That's correct. So
the significance of the result, none of that matters. It's
so what's going to matter in the research objective is whether they do reject the hypothesis or not. Because the assumption that we're going to make in 1 or 2 slides is that the probability of publishing is increasing in the number of discoveries that you make. Yeah. And this is consistent with some of the model of about publication bias, but also about which funding should be published in the first place, where publication should basically publish or in general publish discoveries.
Yes.
And so we take this as granted, as given.
Thank you.
Okay, so there is a social planner, and when we think about the social planner, we can think about the social planner as choosing professional norms or editorial standards. So we speak about the social planner as the editor, but you can think really as an editorial board, which provides norm to researcher. And here we really abstract from editor and journal incentives. That is, the editor will only care about public good and nothing else. So there is no competition between different journals or things like that, which is, of course, interesting for future research. And finally, there is a third player, which is, however, passive. So the third player is the policymaker. And the only thing that the policymaker does is that she reads the research, which has been written by the representative researcher, and then implements the recommended treatments by the researcher. So to be a little bit more specific, the game works as follows. So the researcher decides whether to run a pre-specified experiment with capital J treatments. That is, the decision of the researcher is whether to run an experiment, and the experiment has already capital J treatments, or not to run the experiment. So what this implies is that research opportunities, thus the number of treatments that I'm going to test, arise exogenously. Now, this assumption is relaxed in the appendix, and in fact, in the appendix, we allow also the number of tests to be chosen endogenously by the researcher, which is possible as long as the researcher justify and say how many tests she's going to run in a pre-analysis plan, that is ex ante before running the experiment itself. Now, if the researcher experiments, she's going to draw a vector of statistics X, which is drawn from some distribution F. Now, this distribution F is indexed by some parameter theta. And for the moment, we're going to assume that we have capital J parameters running from θ1 to θj. And you can think about these parameters as the treatment effect induced by each policy from 1 to capital J. The experimenter then writes a paper and reports some discovery or rejections. Now, we're going to denote this discovery with a function R, which is a function of the sample that we just drew. Now, again, this function R has capital J entries running from 1 to capital J. And each entry denotes whether we reject the null hypothesis that policy small j should be recommended or not. So you can think about this test as a one-sided test where policy j is recommended if it has a positive effect. Now, whenever we think about the positive effect of the policy, we are already incorporating in this framework also the cost that the policy will induce in terms of implementation. That is, we should interpret the parameter theta, the treatment effect, as the effect of the policy net of the cost of implementation. Now, the hypothesis testing protocol R will be chosen optimally by the social planner. And so our goal will be to characterize the best R, the best test. So to convey the main idea, let me give you a simple example. Now, in this example, we have capital J treatments, and we can define each treatment to be a binary indicator running from D1 to DJ. Let me consider a simple model where y depends on θ1 times d1, that is the treatment effect of the first policy, times whether the first treatment has been implemented, up to the capital J treatment times the treatment effect of such a policy as well. Now, in this context, our x is just the ULS estimates of our parameters from θ1 to θj. And we can say we can approximate our distribution f of theta to be a Gaussian with some mean theta and variance sigma, which is known. So why a Gaussian? Well, because here we can use some sort of asymptotic approximation, or we can just assume for simplicity that epsilon is Gaussian. And this assumption of Gaussianity is going to play a key role in our framework and is justified by asymptotic approximation. Now, the variance covariance matrix will be assumed to be known.
I've lost your audio, Davide. Can other people still hear Davide?
I lost it as well.
Oh, sorry. You lost me? Am I back?
Variance covariance matrix is known. You're back now. Yes, thank you. And
oh, right. Okay. So we assume that the variance covariance matrix is known, but this is relaxed in the appendix. So what is a testing protocol? So one example is just to look at the small j entry of our function R. And let's consider, for instance, a t-test. So a t-test is just our OLS estimate for the small j policy, rescaled by the standard error. So our goal will be to find the best testing protocol. So any questions so far?
Yeah, I'm going to ask an embarrassingly simple question. Can you give a concrete example of a testing protocol?
Oh, right. The t-test.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. Okay. Fine. Yes. Gotcha.
The t-test, and then maybe you want to find the threshold optimally.
Okay.
Oh, but in our framework, we look at, so we say, okay, let's look at all possible testing protocol. So what is optimal in the class of all possible testing protocols that we can think of? But one example is going to be the t-test. And in fact, it turns out that the t-test is optimal in a certain setting.
Okay. So generalizing slightly, I have in mind a distribution and a threshold, a critical value. Is that?
That's correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. But the class of decision is not restricted only to the threshold, and is not restricted only to the threshold. You can actually show that the t-test is optimal, even if you look at a larger class of testing protocols.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, the policymaker implements the recommended combination of treatments, irrespective of whether the paper gets published. So this means that if the researcher runs the experiment and writes up the paper, then whatever is written in the paper will be implemented, no matter what, whether the paper is published or not. And so you can think about this framework from two different perspectives. The first is that the researcher works closely with NGO when running the experiment, which often happens in development studies. And the second case is instead that the paper will eventually get published in some journal, probably a lower ranked journal, but the policymaker does not really distinguish across different journals, and so doesn't really care about the quality of the journal. So welfare upon experimentation is additive throughout most of this presentation, and we do relax this assumption in the paper. So
Davide, you need that first assumption because this helps align the policymaker's incentives so that the policymaker specifies the optimal testing, so the policymaker doesn't have a flat.
Right. So this assumption is useful because in this way, the policymaker will always implement what the researcher recommends, no matter what. So once the researcher decides to run an experiment, then the policymaker will always act as an active decision maker and will not distinguish papers if they get published or not. That is, the editor cannot actually enforce by yourself the type of policy recommendation. And the idea is the following. If the policymaker were to implement the paper just if the paper got published, then the editor can just decide which paper gets published in the first place. And so the editor itself can also control the policymaking process. And so that's not the case because the policymaker will implement the policy as long as the paper gets written and not necessarily published.
I guess I'm trying to understand who's controlling. So are you going to have you're going to have some sort of first best result or second best result in terms of? So the editor controls an editorial policy. The policymaker controls a testing regime. Do we have any sort of welfare results? I've missed.
Sorry, yes. So the editor controls the testing regime. So the editor say which tests should be implemented. The policymaker does not control anything. So the policymaker.
Oh, it's the passive agent. Okay.
Right. Exactly.
Yep. Thank you.
Any other question? All right. So welfare upon experimentation is additive. What this means is that let's take U of theta to be the utility generated by some given treatment configuration. And let's say that this U of theta is actually the identity function. Now, additivity implies that welfare upon certain recommendation R of X will be awaited, basically will be linear in the parameter theta multiplying by the recommendation itself. So this is consistent with the linear model that I just described in the previous example, where there are no interaction effects between different policies. That is, there are no complementarities between policies. And this is plausible also when treatments are very different, or when each treatment corresponds to treating different subpopulations, for instance, people of different age, and there are no cross-group spillovers between different populations. Now, later, I'm going to discuss settings where there are interactions between policies. That is where you can also think about complementarities, and this will change a little bit the results. So let's look at the game from a more mathematical perspective. So the first stage is where the social planner who doesn't know theta, that is, the social planner doesn't know the treatment effect that the policy will generate, will choose the testing protocol R to maximize the worst case welfare. Now, let me read the expression from right to left. So let me first start from this VR of theta. Now, what is this VR of theta? Well, this VR of theta is the utility generated by a given recommendation R for a given treatment configuration theta. Now, the utility will depend implicitly on the researcher's decision. Now, if the researcher does not experiment, then the utility will be 0 because we're going to stick to the baseline intervention. And so there is no change in any policy recommendation, and so utility will stay at 0. On the other hand, if the researcher experiments, the utility will be the average effect of a given policy recommendation. And the average effect is given by this linear form, where U of theta is the identity function, and where we average over the distribution of the drawn sample, that is, of the sample that eventually the researcher will obtain by running the experiment. Now, we don't know theta, and this implies that we're going to look at the minimum over theta in the parameter space, capital theta. Now, once we look at the minimum, we're going to choose the best policy, R, that is, we're going to maximize our utility. Now, given the best policy R star, now the researcher makes a decision. So the researcher, which we assume knows theta, that is, knows the parameter, and this assumption is not needed for our result. In fact, it's relaxed in the appendix. But for the moment, let's assume that she knows theta for simplicity. The experiments will obtain some utility by running the experiment, and will decide whether to run the experiment if such utility is positive. Now, we can think about different utility functions, and so the simplest form of utility function is also linear in the number of discoveries. That is, this utility function says that ex ante, so before running the experiment, my expected utility will depend on how many discoveries I will do.
Martina has a question. Sorry, Davide, to interrupt. Do you mind taking that?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to take the question.
Yes, sorry. Just wanting to ask about the research cost. With research cost, you mean the monetary cost of the experiment, or other type, I don't know, more like time, opportunity cost of time, or these kind of things? Just not precisely clear to me where the trade-off apply in this situation.
Right. When we think about research costs, we think about all possible costs that the researcher may incur. So you can think about this as a time cost, as the money, so an accounting and also opportunity costs of running the experiment. For simplicity, we are going to think about mostly as the accounting costs of running the experiment, but in practice, you may think about an opportunity cost, for instance, the cost of writing up the grant to obtain the funding, or the cost of actually conducting the experiment and managing the infrastructure and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It's clear now.
Okay, so here we have basically some utility of the experimenter, which depends on the cost, as just discussed. And then it also depends on the benefit that we would obtain from publication. And now we're going to assume that this benefit is linear in the number of discoveries. So we can think about this utility as a rescale by J, the number of treatments, linear publication probability. That is the probability of publishing. But you can think about also other form of utility, and I'm going to discuss those later on. Now, let's look at the first proposition. So the proposition states the following. R star is max-min optimal if and only if two conditions hold. The first condition is that the utility of the experimenter at R star is negative for all theta in a given subset of the parameter space theta 0. And the second is that it's positive for all theta that are not in such a subset. Now let me try to give you a visualization in a two-dimensional setting where we have a theta 2 and a theta 1. Now what is theta 0? Theta 0 is the configuration of treatments where both treatments are negative. So in this plot, theta 0 is the negative orthant where both theta 2 and theta 1 are negative. Now this condition is intuitive, and it states that whenever research will always inform policymaking and affect welfare negatively, no matter what is theta 2 and theta 1, because both of them are negative in this subspace, then we don't want to induce experimentation. That is, we want to make sure that the utility of the researcher is negative. Now, whenever that's not the case, that is, whenever we're not in theta 0, we still want to ensure that the utility generated by running the experiment is positive. And this result provides a complete formalization, a complete characterization of the max-min rule, and does not really rely on the function, on the assumption on the function that I just made before. That is, it does not rely on the particular functional form of the utility or of the experimenter utility. Now, to understand a little bit the second condition, let's look at the case again in a two-dimensional setting. Now, in a two-dimensional setting, we may have the two different orthants, and in these orthants, the effect of a policy is positive, and the effect of a different policy is instead negative. Now, condition B states that even in this orthant, the overall welfare effect is still positive. That is, even if one of the policy will have a negative effect, then the other needs to induce a larger effect which outweighs the negative effect of the first policy. Now, there is one last orthant, and the last orthant is where both policies are positive. Now, whenever both policies are positive, this condition trivially holds. Now, there is a natural connection between the game theoretical structure that we derive and control and size control in this setting. Now, in particular, condition A provides some insight of the type of size control that we need to induce. So by looking at the case where we have some sort of linearity in the publication prospects, the first condition states that the sum of the probability of the first policy and the second policy being equal to 1, conditional on theta in the null space, that is theta in the set where both parameters are negative, needs to be small enough. In particular, it needs to be smaller than the cost of running an experiment with two treatments. That is, there is a natural connection between size control and the cost of running the experiment itself. Now, the intuition is what I just described. That is, the plan and maximize welfare by keeping the publication probability low enough whenever running an experiment will induce bad policy advice. Now, what's interesting here is that as we increase J, that is, as we increase the number of treatment, the left-hand side of the constraint might become larger. Now, if the cost does not increase in the number of treatments, what this implies is that we need to impose a more and more stringent control of size as the number of treatment increases. That is, naturally justify multiple hypothesis testing adjustment whenever the cost is fixed with the number of treatments. However, if the cost increases with the number of treatments, then there is some trade-off of whether we want to induce some multiple hypothesis testing adjustment or not. Now, one problem of this max-min protocol characterization is that we have many rules that can be max-min. And a simple example is the rule where we always reject, where we never reject. That is the rule where R is always equal to 0. Now, this rule will be such that the experimenter never runs the experiment and the welfare is always 0. Now, of course, we want to rule out this type of trivial protocols, and we would like to find a protocol in the class of max-min rule which uniformly dominates all other protocols for all possible parameters. We know that that's possible whenever j is equal to 1, that is, whenever we only test one single treatment. However, it's not possible whenever j is greater than 1, as we show in a proposition. That is, in the next proposition, what we show is that there exists no max-min recommendation function which uniformly outperform all other functions across all possible parameter configurations. Now, this is a negative result, and it challenges a little bit our analysis because it means that we cannot find a protocol which is the best uniformly across all possible parameter space. And so we need to make a choice. Within the class of max-min rule, we need to choose some rules which outperforms others for some treatment configurations. Now, how do we make this choice? Well, we think in terms of power now. That is, we want to find rules which are powerful. And we need to think in terms of a suitable notion of power in the context of multiple hypothesis testing. Now, what we do is that we look at a notion of local power, which broadly connect to previous notion of local power with some distinction, which works as follows. We're going to look at the parameter space where both parameters are positive. And we're going to say, OK, let's let at least one of the two parameters to have a small positive effect epsilon. Now let's compare two different rules, R and R prime, in this parameter space. And let's say that one rule R dominates the other rule R prime if both of them are max-min optimal, but at the same time, if the worst case power in the alternative space is larger as we let epsilon going to 0. That is, as we approach the intercept, as we approach the null space. Now, this notion of local power is, first of all, consistent with the max-min protocol that we just adopted, because it's also a max-min rule, where max-min is not with respect to the null space now, but with respect to the alternative space. Now, at the same time, from a partitioner perspective, it conveys the idea that we want to find a rule which is more powerful locally near the null space. That is more powerful as the treatment effect is not that large, it's quite small. Now, one nice property of this notion is that whenever we can find a rule which is locally most powerful and max-min, then this rule will also be unmissable, as we show in a different proposition. Now, any other question? All right, so let me provide a characterization of what are the rules which are both max-min and locally most powerful. Now, let's suppose that we can find an R star which is max-min. Then R star is also locally most powerful if it satisfies the following condition, that for any j, so for any entry of our discovery, being equal to 1, given theta being equal to 0, the probability of such discovery is equal to the cost of running the experiment as a function of the number of treatments that we have, divided by the number of treatments themselves. So what this condition implies is the following. So if before the characterization of max-min rule was stating that what we need to ensure is that the sum of this probability is less or equal than the cost of running the experiment, now we are locally most powerful if the sum of this probability is actually equal to the cost of running the experiment. That is, if we use all the budget that we have when running the experiment. Now, there is a problem here, and the problem is that it's not clear whether there exists a rule which is both max-min and satisfy this condition with equality. Now, what we show is that if X is Gaussian with some in theta and some covariance matrix sigma, separate t-testing, that is what I just discussed before, where we look at our, say, OLS estimate and then rescale by the standard error, greater or equal than a threshold, is both max-min optimal and also locally most powerful. That is the most powerful thing that you can do in the class of max-min optimal decisions, where the threshold needs to be chosen appropriately. In particular, the threshold will depend on the cost of running the experiment and also the number of treatment arms. Now, to be a little bit more specific, let me say that we can decompose the cost into two components. The first component is a fixed cost, and the second component is a variable cost. Now, the optimal critical value of our t-test will depend basically on the sum of the fixed cost and the variable cost divided by the number of treatments. Now, what this implies is the following. Suppose that the fixed cost is equal to alpha and there are no variable costs whatsoever. Now, the critical value will be adjusted through a Bonferroni correction. That is, the critical value that we're going to use will be equal, the size that we're going to consider will be equal to alpha divided by the number of treatment arms. And so the idea here
is... Just to understand, Davide, you get Bonferroni as a special case then, is that...
That's correct. So Bonferroni holds whenever the cost does not scale at all with the number of treatments, and is max min optimal and also locally most powerful when you use a t-test with Bonferroni correction, with assuming this linearity structure. And then there is no, suppose now instead that there are no fixed costs, but the variable costs actually scale with the number of treatments, then there is no need to do any multiple hypothesis testing adjustment whatsoever. And the idea is that if the cost grows with the number of treatment that I'm going to consider, then the multiple hypothesis testing adjustment is already implicit in the cost structure. So there is no need to do an additional adjustment. So in our paper, we also consider more complicated models. So for instance, we consider a model where the publication probability is not linear in the number of discoveries, but instead is a threshold function, which depends on whether there are at least kappa treatments which are found to be significant, to have a significant effects. Now, this type of function leads to a much more complicated analysis, but also from this structure, it turns out a separate t-test is optimal, but the critical value is chosen a little bit differently, so it has no such a nice explicit expression. Instead, the expression is a little bit more implicit, but similar conclusion holds also in this setup. Now, we also look at a case where there are interaction in the welfare effects. That is, there is not only a threshold crossing rule for the publication probability, but you also have a welfare which depends on interaction between different treatments. Now, this becomes way more complicated, and it turns out that it rationalizes family-wise error rate between groups of treatments, where the size of the group depends on this kappa. That is, on whether the group has at least kappa treatments. That is, the group can lead to is sufficient for publication. And here, the characterization of locally most powerful protocol under independence works as follows. We're going to recommend a group if it has the largest effect across all possible groups, and it also leads to significant results. So the key intuition here is that the analysis where you also have an interaction becomes much more complicated, but it can provide some justification in this setup to family-wise error rate control. All right, so to summarize this first part of the talk, when we analyze the case of multiple treatments, it turns out that whenever research costs exhibit meaningful returns to scale, then we need to do a multiple hypothesis testing adjustment with a Bonferroni correction in the special case where this return to scale is actually when there are no variable costs whatsoever, and there are only fixed costs. When instead research cost is approximately linear in the number of treatments, then there is no need to do any multiple hypothesis testing adjustment. Now, I'm going to briefly discuss the context of multiple outcomes in the following slides. So before I move on, any questions so far?
So the intuition for that is that the temptation to over-test increases with the economies of scale, and so that's what Bonferroni is leaning against. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so you're adding the friction to. Okay, yep. So it's a penalty term then in the okay.
That's correct. Because please.
I'm thinking A, I'm thinking aloud, and B, I'm thinking outside of my area. So this is dangerous. But I guess with standard machine learning techniques like lasso or ridge, you're penalizing overfitting, and so here you're penalizing overtesting. Is there some encompassing framework that I mean, is it worth making that connection, or is that?
So we haven't thought in that direction because the point here is that the correction is made ex ante before you see the data. So the correction is not data dependent. That is, it doesn't depend on the sample that you draw.
Sure.
So if that, yeah. Please.
So if I'm running a lasso or a ridge regression, I set my penalty parameter in advance as well.
Oh, I see.
And then I do my estimation.
I see what you mean.
I don't know whether this is a useful.
Yeah, so we haven't thought about this connection. I think there might be something interesting for sure, and I definitely see your point.
I mean, it could be nice if it allows you to subsume the analysis into a framework, an existing framework, or connect the analysis at least to a well-established existing framework. That might be helpful. But
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
No, yeah, definitely. But the thing is that yeah, I think the framework that we look at is a little bit different from. So the problem that we are trying to address is not an estimation problem, and so this is why like thinking in terms of lasso, etc., does not arise naturally in our framework. But I definitely see your point, and there might be interesting connection there in the sense that you may want to rule out some parameters ex ante already, and then just look at a subset of such parameter. Implicitly, this type of analysis, so basically, in one of our extensions, we look at a case where the researcher can actually choose to test a subset of the hypothesis and not all of them, and this naturally induces sparsity on the hypothesis that we're going to test. But this is again done ex ante, so it's not done once you look at the data. So this is the difference from this. Why it's not an estimation problem. But I definitely see your point, and yeah. Okay, I'm gonna jump into the multiple outcomes unless there are any other questions. Okay, so in the multiple outcome setting, what we have is that we have capital J outcomes running from 1 to capital J associated with some vector of statistics. We can think, for instance, again, a treatment effect estimated on each outcome. So for example, let's suppose that our outcome small j is equal to some intercept plus the treatment effect of the policy. We have a single policy D plus some noise. And then our X is just the OLS estimate obtained from each separate regression. Now, there is an audience of capital J policymakers, and each policymaker has their own utility. Now, this utility is a weighted combination of the treatment effect generated on a given outcome, theta G, times the weights associated to that outcome, which are policymaker specific. That is, different policymakers may care about different outcomes differently. And the researcher makes capital J recommendation, one for each policymaker. So our R function is again a vector which runs from 1 to capital J, where capital J now is not the number of treatments, but is the number of policymakers. Why we choose this? Well, because each entry of R needs to be a policymaking recommendation. And so in this context, policymaking recommendation arises naturally if we think in terms of multiple policymakers that care about different outcomes differently. So the social problem again maximizes the welfare worst case with respect to both the treatment effect, but also with respect to the policymaker identity. And so we can think about this setup as having uncertainty, not only with respect to treatment effect, but also with respect to who is going to actually implement the policy, with respect to the type of result that is going to be reported. And we can have two scenarios. One is where the research informs heterogeneous audience, which means that we have many policymakers. And the second one is instead where the research informs an homogeneous audience, which means that we have one single policymaker. So let's look at the case where we have multiple policymakers. Now, in the context of multiple policymakers, it turns out that the characterization of the null space is a little bit different. And in fact, the null space is the set of parameter theta such that the utility for each policymaker J is negative for some J from 1 to capital J. Now, let's look again at the case with two treatments. In this case, with two outcomes. Now, what this implies is that the null space is not only the orthant where both theta 2 and theta 1 are negative, but is in fact the orthant where at least one of the two parameters is negative. That is, the null space is much larger than the null space that we obtained in the previous analysis. Now, the idea is that if one parameter is negative, we cannot compensate the negativity of one parameter with the positivity of the other, because we're going to be worst case with respect to the parameters themselves. And it turns out that our study is max-min optimal if and only if the utility of the researcher is negative for any theta in this larger set theta 0. Now, what this implies is that if we think of hypothesis testing with multiple outcomes, we can be quite conservative. Now, to illustrate the point, suppose that each policymaker cares about a single outcome only, and each cares about a different outcome. Let's again consider a linear publication probability as we had before. Now, in this context, what turns out is that the t-tests are only max-min with infinite critical values. That is, a t-test can be max-min only if we always if we never reject, no matter what. So this is extremely conservative. What we need instead to do is that somehow we need to aggregate statistics. So, for example, we can construct a max-min rule if we look at the minimum effect across all possible outcomes or across all possible statistics which we sample. Now, a second feature of this framework is that we can provide a direct mapping between the publication rule and the max-min protocol. So again, let's go back to a publication rule now which is not linear, but depends on a threshold function. That is, I'm going to publish if there are at least kappa discovery. Now, if this is your publication rule, multiple hypothesis testing adjustment will rationalize family-wise error rate. Actually, in this context, kappa family-wise error rate control. So the idea here is that through this game between different agents, we can provide some rationalization of different type of error control. I'm going to skip this slide. So to summarize the context of with an heterogeneous audience, what turns out to be is that we can rationalize multiple hypothesis testing adjustment, but in fact, this rationalization can lead to statements which are very conservative. So a natural follow-up question is whether we can be less conservative if we look at a different problem where we have a single policymaker, but the policymaker may care about the different outcomes differently. So going back to this second problem, let's consider the context where we have a single policymaker, which make one single policy decision. That is, the recommendation function will be binary, either 0 or 1. Now, the experimental utility is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis, net of the cost, where the cost depends on the number of outcomes that I do collect. Now, it turns out that it's optimal in this context to run a t-test, which are based on weighted combination of our statistics rescaled by the standard error, where the weights are chosen appropriately, and the critical value depends on the cost of running the experiment again. The choice of the weights will depend on the interpretation of the statistics that we have. Now, to be a little bit more specific, let's first suppose that each xg, each entry, measures the impact on an economically distinct concept. So, for example, you can think about studies which report the effect of a single microcredit intervention on the livelihoods of individuals and the women's empowerment. So, for instance, in an educational program, you can think about intervention which care about math score and literacy score, and you care about them separately. And let's assume that each of these objectives has some weight, which is assigned by the policymaker, and this weight is known. So we can interpret this weight to be an economic weight which is posed on different objectives. Now, what this implies is that economic aggregation, that is running a test where we take a weighted combination of our estimated effects, where the weights are actually have a meaningful, have an economic meaning, is going to be max-min optimal, but also locally most powerful. So in this context, the suggested practical approach is to elicit the weights from the policymaker and try to construct tests which use such weights, which reflect preference of the policymaker for different outcomes. Now, this is quite not satisfying because sometimes we may want to collect different outcomes just because different outcomes are different measurement of, say, a latent factor. For example, we can think about income and expenditure-based measure of transfer multipliers in an application on cash transfer program. Or going back to our education example, we can think about collecting different scores to be measure of ability, and we may ultimately just care about ability. Now, if that's the case, what we can assume is that the expectation of each outcome is going to be the same across different outcomes, but its outcomes are just separate, noisy observation of the same underlying factor. Now, in this context, it turns out to be optimal to do aggregation, which is not economic, but statistical, which means that aggregation will depend on weights which are chosen to maximize power, or better, to minimize the variance that we obtain from our index. Now, intuitively, these results justify indexing, which people do in practice when dealing with multiple outcomes. So, any questions so far? All right, let me jump towards the end of the talk. So let me just make a statement of why, in our context, the indexing may be better than just running a multiple hypothesis testing adjustment, such as Bonferroni with multiple outcomes. And the idea in our context is quite intuitive. We can think about multiple hypothesis testing with multiple outcomes as a two-step procedure. That is, first, report a vector of statistics for different outcomes, and then try to map this vector of statistics for each different outcome, where each entry is a binary entry, either 0 or 1, to a single decision, which is going to be either 0 or 1 itself. That is, it's going to be either you recommend or don't recommend a given policy, which is a single policy. Now, intuitively, this two-step procedure, which will first impose multiple hypothesis testing adjustment for the effect on different outcomes, and then aggregate the test result across different outcomes, is less efficient than indexing, just because it reduces the information that we can use from our sample. And so this is why, in the particular context of multiple outcomes and a single policymaker, it turns out that indexing might be optimal. So to conclude, now we analyze the case of multiple outcomes in two contexts, with the heterogeneous audience, where we do have some conservative multiple hypothesis testing adjustment, and with an homogeneous audience, where we make two distinctions. The first is where the outcomes measure the same underlying concepts, which justify aggregation through statistical weighting. And the second is instead where it measures distinct concepts, so different economic objective. In this case, we want still to do indexing, but we want to use the weights which have some economic interpretation. So in the paper, you find a few extensions. For instance, we discussed the case where the number of treatment arms is endogenous and pre-specified by the researcher before running the experiment, and possibly chosen optimally, where theta is unknown also to the researcher, and instead the researcher has a prior on the treatment effect, which is shared with the policymaker. We also have a context where some researchers are benevolent. So what this implies is that there are some researchers which only cares about the publication prospect, but others care about welfare. But the decision maker, the editor, is going to be worst case with respect to the type of the researcher, and this will not change our results. And as I was discussing before, we also studied a problem where you have different forms of interaction, both in the publication process and welfare. Now, what we are currently doing is that we're partnering with the JPOL, and we're running a meta-analysis of experimental projects which have been submitted to JPOL and received funding to try to map the cost of each experiment to the number of treatments, and try to provide some more quantitative formulation and justification to the cost which we discussed so far. So to conclude this talk, in this talk, what we studied is are two different problems. One is with multiple treatments, and the other is with multiple outcomes. In the context of multiple treatments, there is a natural one-to-one mapping between treatments and policymaking. And this one-to-one mapping also provides us tools to justify multiple hypothesis testing adjustment if there are return to scale in the number of treatments that we consider, or if there is no need to run to have any hypothesis testing adjustment. And then we studied the problem of multiple outcomes, both with an heterogeneous and homogeneous audience. So this is pretty much it, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Davide. Who's got questions? Let's jump in, unmute yourselves, and let's have an open discussion if we can. If we don't have any formal questions, I'll stop recording. If you've got time, Davide, to stay around for... Oh, Martina, very good. I was hoping.
Yeah, hello.
Welcome.
I actually have a few questions, if I can.
Please, yeah.
Okay, so like I hope I understood most of your project, and thank you a lot for the really interesting talk and conversations. I think this topic is really important today, so it's good things to address. I was wondering about, like, my first comment or questions was about your hypothesis of the policymaking behavior. Mm-hmm. So like my intuition is that like you change the hypothesis on the policymaker and your true effect in a way to look also at some welfare conclusions. The point is that I do not find really convincing, in particular the first one, in the sense that you are saying that policymaker will implement the policy no matter the results. So in this point, you are not taking into account the fact that the policymaker could have his own objective functions and maximize things that are different from the research objective, etc. But I know that it will be maybe too difficult to address also these issues in your paper. But on the other way, it seems to me that in particular for the first part, maybe it's not so relevant to do this kind of hypothesis, as maybe you can just say that you focus on the research part, because like in my sense, adding this kind of behavior could be maybe difficult to explain, and maybe it's just more convincing to say we focused on the incentives through research and so on. But of course, I want to listen at your point of view. And even like for the second one, you were saying that policymaker cares about different outcome. Even this could not precisely be the case if we think about like the median voter theorem, for example, saying that policymakers just care about re-elections, then maybe can care about different treatment, but maybe they focus on the same outcome. So even this, maybe like you can try to justify it better. And yes, I have just another comment. Do you want to answer or?
Whatever you prefer.
Yeah, just saying left things is more like general comment. I'm not sure to think deep about it, but the point is that in some way the researcher could care also about having an original result, not only having a significant result, but in order to maximize its publication, normally the research should also be something that is original. So in some way, it found something that is maybe goes opposite directions for previous study and so on. So if this is the case, do you think that there will be over incentives in choosing more treatment in order to find an original result or not?
Yeah, so let me address first the second question and then the first question. Okay, so on the originality of results, so here we treat each test symmetrically, which means that each test has the same effect on the publication probability. But again, each test, what it does is that it changes the baseline intervention. So the intuition here is that each test will be innovative in the sense that it's going to generate new policy advice because the policymaker is not currently implementing that particular policy. Now, you can also think about originality, etc. Of course, this can be interesting avenue for future research, but in the paper, what we really do is that we focus on finding significant effects, because from the perspective of our paper, what really matters is that if you find a significant effect, it means that you can change current policy and possibly improve current policy. That is, there is a direct connection between the significant and new decisions, which change with respect to the baseline. But we don't have any notion of asymmetry between discoveries, so that's right. But I also think that it's an interesting future direction, but it's not something that directly enters in our model. So that's correct. The first question was about the policymaker being a passive player, etc. Okay, so this actually is motivated by what actually happens in practice. So when we think about policymaker, we can think about different policymakers. The one that you were mentioning is I don't know, mayor of the city or people who run for elections. But policymaker is not necessarily who runs for election. Policymaker can be, for instance, an appointed minister, or can be also a decision maker from an NGO. So going back to our example of cash transfer program, there are many examples of NGO which actually run experiment to change where they change their own policy, for instance, who are going to be targeted, in collaboration with researcher. And researcher motivate this experiment and then write up the paper. And at the same time, the NGO respond to this paper by implementing the new policy. And there are many of these type of collaborations. And in fact, the current empirical project that we're currently pursuing try also to focus on this type of experiment, that is an experiment development studies, where this often occurs. So this is mostly the type of policymaker that we have in mind, not as much as the mayor that you were mentioning. Or sorry, not that you were mentioning, but the
I was referring to,
so this is what really motivates our perspective. Yeah. Let me jump in briefly. I should stop the live stream and the recording at some point. So I'm going to propose that we completely artificially thank you here, Davide, and we applaud or something like that. And then if you've got time, we continue the conversation.
For sure, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, okay, so heartfelt thanks, of course, and genuine applause. Thank you very much, Davide. I found that fascinating. We'll cut the Martina, you're welcome to applaud as well. We could have an audience of 2 applauding, and so thank you very much. I'm cutting the live stream, and then
Before you do, I want to thank you and thanks all the organizer. It was a pleasure. So thank you very much.
Grazie mille.